Hesse, West Germany, 1963. A three-man American crew sits in a Jeep in the Fulda Gap, waiting for the Soviet armor everyone expects to come through it. Bolted to the back is what looks like a short-barreled bazooka, and clipped inside, in a case the size of a watermelon, is one of the smallest nuclear weapons the United States has ever built. Their job, if the Soviets come, is to fire it from 2 kilometers away, which is just outside the radius at which it will kill them. To understand how a three-man crew in the Fulda Gap ended up carrying a tactical nuclear weapon on the back of a Jeep, you have to start with the problem the United States Army was looking at across the inner German border in the late 1950s. On the Soviet side of that border were 19 group of Soviet forces in Germany, armored and motorized divisions, equipped with T-54 and T-55 tanks, and configured to drive west in a single coordinated thrust at the moment the Cold War turned hot. The doctrine they intended to execute was straightforward: mass armor concentrated on the narrowest viable corridor and run it through NATO's forward defense at speed. The narrowest viable corridor, by every Allied map and every wargame NATO ran through the decade, was the Fulda Gap, a flat valley running west from Eisenach toward Frankfurt that bypassed the worst of the German hills and pointed almost directly at the Rhine. The American forces stationed across that gap, principally the 7th Army's V Corps with the 3rd Armored Division at its center, were outnumbered and would, in any honest analysis, be outflanked within hours of a Soviet push. Conventional doctrine offered no good answer because the conventional answer was more tanks, more artillery, and more infantry, none of which Congress was inclined to fund in the numbers that would have been required. What the Army did have by the late 1950s was the world's most advanced nuclear weapons program, and what its planners reached for, when the conventional answer failed, was the option of meeting Soviet armor with battlefield nuclear weapons. The result was a class of weapon the Army called tactical nuclear, by which it meant nuclear weapons small enough, mobile enough, and theoretically discriminating enough to be used on a battlefield rather than against a city. The Army built a great many of them, ranging from atomic artillery shells to short-range ballistic missiles, all of them committed to the same flawed assumption that a nuclear weapon could be used in close support of friendly troops without consuming the friendly troops in the process. And the smallest, lightest, and most aggressively misconceived of them was a recoilless rifle, 3 feet long, mounted on the back of an M38 Jeep that fired a sub-kiloton fission warhead at a range of 2 kilometers. They named it the Davy Crockett, after the frontiersman who died at the Alamo. Development began at Picatinny Arsenal in the mid-1950s, with the engineering work distributed across Watervliet Arsenal in upstate New York, Rock Island Arsenal in Illinois, and a network of supporting facilities at Frankfurt, Aberdeen, Lake City, and Watertown. The original designation was the Battle Group Atomic Delivery System, an acronym so unwieldy that even the Army gave up on it, and by August of 1958, the project had been renamed for the Tennessee frontiersman who died defending the Alamo against Santa Anna's troops in 1836. The man behind it, more than any other, was General Maxwell D. Taylor, the Army Chief of Staff, who had built his career on the idea that the United States Army needed to fight on a nuclear battlefield rather than be replaced by the Air Force on one. Taylor's adopted pentomic division concept, the reorganization of American ground forces around the assumption that the next war would involve battlefield nuclear weapons in routine use, treated the Davy Crockett as a key infantry-level component, a weapon that would put a tactical nuclear option in the hands of every battalion. What the engineers delivered was 2 versions of essentially the same weapon: the M28, a 120mm recoilless rifle with a range of 1¼ miles, and the M29, a 155mm version with a range of 2½ miles. Both fired the same projectile, the M388 atomic round, an 11-inch diameter, 31-inch long, 76-pound fission warhead that the men who carried it called the atomic watermelon. Inside that watermelon sat the W-54 warhead, the smallest nuclear device ever fielded by the United States military. It weighed 51 pounds, contained roughly 1½ kilograms of plutonium and 2½ kilograms of weapons-grade uranium, and produced a yield of between 10 and 20 tons of TNT equivalent. That made it about 1,000 times less powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima, which sounds, on first hearing, almost manageable, until you remember that an industrial-grade conventional bomb weighs at most a few hundred pounds, and that 10 to 20 tons of TNT is still 10 to 20 tons of TNT. The launcher was a smoothbore recoilless tube that could be mounted on a tripod in the field, slung in the back of an M113 armored personnel carrier, or, most famously, bolted to the rear platform of a stripped-down M38 Jeep. The crew, 3 men, fired a small spotting round, first from a separate 20 or 37mm rifle attached underneath the main tube. The propellant charge went down the muzzle by hand. The atomic watermelon was loaded onto a spigot at the back, like a rifle grenade. The crew then ran a 22-meter detonating cord, took cover, and fired. The projectile left the launcher at 100 miles per hour, which was, of course, the problem. Because the W-54 was, by nuclear standards, almost vanishingly small in explosive yield, its blast and heat effects were correspondingly limited. The concussion would be lethal to roughly 60 meters from the point of detonation. The thermal pulse would do limited damage at any meaningful distance. What the W-54 did do efficiently, and at considerable range, was emit prompt neutron radiation in the first instant of the chain reaction. The kind of radiation that walks straight through unshielded tank armor and kills crews inside their vehicles within minutes. The 100% instant casualty radius, as Army documents put it in the bureaucratic language that survives in the declassified field manuals, was in excess of 520 feet, roughly 160 meters. The lethal radiation pulse reached substantially further. Crews inside armored vehicles, the people the weapon was actually designed to kill, would receive a fatal dose at 200 meters and a near certain fatal dose at 300 meters. Unprotected infantry would be incapacitated within minutes at 400 meters and dead within hours at 600. Now, hold those numbers next to the M28's range, 2 kilometers, 2,000 meters. The radiation pulse that would kill the crew of a Soviet tank at 300 meters would, under the wrong wind conditions, or in the wrong terrain, or at the closer end of the weapon's envelope, kill the crew of the Jeep that fired it. The Army was aware of this. The Davy Crockett crews were trained to fire from behind a hill, drop their heads below the parapet, and rely on the 22-meter detonating cord to put as much terrain as possible between themselves and the weapon they had just launched. Matthew Seelinger, chief historian of the Army Historical Foundation, summarized the institutional position decades later, with the kind of careful phrasing the Army prefers when it cannot quite bring itself to say the obvious. While the Army never officially stated that the Davy Crockett would likely render the crew a fatal dose of radiation, it was known that there was a significant chance that would occur unless the crew was well shielded, which is the Army's way of saying the men firing it were probably going to die from firing it. The Davy Crockett entered service in May of 1961, after 4 years of testing at Forts Greely and Wainwright in Alaska, Yuma Proving Ground in Arizona, and the Pohakuloa Training Area in Hawaii. The first units to receive it were the 7th Army's infantry and armored battalions in West Germany, with sections assigned to headquarters companies of every combat maneuver battalion and V Corps. Those battalions had pre-assigned positions in the Fulda Gap under what the Army called the General Defense Plan, and the Davy Crockett sections rolled forward with them every time the inner German border went on alert. Davy Crockett's also went to the Pacific Theater, to the 8th Army in Korea, and to units stationed in Guam, Hawaii, and Okinawa, anywhere the Cold War touched a possible front line. By the mid-1960s, more than 2,000 atomic watermelons had been produced and dispersed across American positions around the world. What underwrote that dispersal, on paper, was a series of executive orders from the Kennedy and Johnson White Houses authorizing the Department of Defense to take nuclear weapons out of Atomic Energy Commission custody and place them in the hands of field commanders. National Security Action Memorandum 334, signed by President Johnson on the 1st of June 1965, was one of the most consequential. It authorized the dispersal of thousands of nuclear weapons to forward positions for the 1965 and 66 fiscal years, with specific allocations for Europe, the Pacific, and the continental United States, much of it now declassified and readable in the LBJ Library Archive. The Davy Crockett was a small fraction of that total, but it was a fraction sitting on Jeep platforms in the Fulda Gap, with a 3-man crew and a 1-week training course, attached to maneuver battalions whose commanding officers had release authority under conditions Congress was never told about in any detail. The Little Feller 1 test, conducted at the Nevada test site on the 17th of July, 1962, as part of Operation Sunbeam, fired a live W-54 from a Davy Crockett M29 launcher in front of an audience that included Attorney General Robert Kennedy and General Maxwell Taylor. It produced a yield of about 18 tons, performed exactly as designed, and remains, to this day, the last above-ground nuclear test the United States has ever conducted. The M388 was withdrawn from Europe in August of 1967. The 55th and 56th Infantry platoons of the 82nd Airborne Division, the last American units equipped with the M29, were deactivated in the middle of 1968. The system was formally retired in 1971. When the formal retirement was announced, Brigadier General Alvin Cowan, Assistant Division Commander of the 3rd Armored Division, the unit at the center of the Fulda Gap defense this episode opens with, was asked why. His answer, on the record, was that the decision had been twofold: the high personnel costs of operating the Davy Crockett in the field, and, quoting Cowan directly, a great fear that some sergeant would start a nuclear war. By the time the decision to withdraw was being made, the reasons had become difficult to argue against from any direction. The accuracy of a smoothbore launcher firing a fin-stabilized projectile at 100 miles per hour was, in any honest assessment, poor. The radiation envelope made the weapon nearly as dangerous to friendly troops as to the enemy. The political consequences of any release authority being delegated as far down the chain of command as the Davy Crockett required were difficult to defend in front of any audience that took the question seriously. What replaced it was nothing, and that absence was the most consequential thing about the Davy Crockett's legacy. The Army quietly walked away from the idea of an infantry-level tactical nuclear weapon, because the idea, on inspection, did not survive the inspection. By the time the M29s were being crated up and shipped back to the Pantex plant in Texas for dismantlement, the doctrinal moment that had created them, the Pentatomic Division, the assumption of routine battlefield nuclear use, the conviction that small enough warheads could be employed without strategic escalation, had collapsed under its own weight. Maxwell Taylor's vision of an army that fought on a nuclear battlefield had been replaced very quietly by an army that planned not to. Return for a moment to that 3-man crew in the Fulda Gap, sitting in a jeep at the edge of a tree line, watching the inner German border for the Soviet armor everyone expected to come through it. They have been trained to fire the Davy Crockett, take cover behind a hill, and survive the radiation pulse from the weapon they have just launched. The Army has not told them, in any official document, that they are very likely to die in the process of doing their job. The Army has not needed to tell them. They have done the arithmetic themselves. 2 kilometers of range, 300 meters of lethal radiation, a smoothbore launcher firing a fin-stabilized watermelon at 100 miles per hour. In the rough direction of a Soviet tank company, they may or may not be able to see through the trees. They are sitting on the smallest nuclear weapon the United States has ever fielded, and the firing pin in their hands is, more or less, their own. That closes the Davy Crockett file on the battle ledger. Where we go next, we leave the Fulda Gap behind and step into another corner of Cold War weapons history that the official record has, for many of the reasons you might expect, preferred not to dwell on. Another absurd on paper weapon. Another moment when the institutional answer was to build the thing first and ask the harder questions only after the thing had been deployed. Subscribe. You don't want to miss this one. Gary Gordon's rifle was a commercial catalog item bought from Colt. Randy Shugert's rifle was a weapon his own army had tried to retire. The exploding rat was 100 dead rodents that never went off. The hedgehog was 24 British spikes that, when they worked, never gave the enemy the courtesy of a warning. The M1 carbine was a backup weapon that walked 1,000 miles behind enemy lines and changed what Americans expected from a rifle. The grease gun was the cheapest weapon the United States Army ever issued, and the one it could not bring itself to retire. The AR-18 was the rifle the world refused to buy, and then spent 30 years quietly turning into every other rifle it built, And the Davy Crockett was a nuclear weapon whose lethal radius reached back to the men who fired it. And the United States Army built it anyway. All 8 did more damage than their makers ever planned for.